Hey guys, it's Angelo, and welcome to my Shadow Priest rotation guide for the launch of Shadowlands in patch 9.0.2. Shadowlands is the perfect time for you to get into this brand new Shadow Priest rotation, learning its ins and its outs, and in what better way than with a step-by-step guide of this new rotation we'll be playing. A lot of things have changed for the Shadow Priest, and if you haven't stayed up to date on all of my Shadowlands Alpha and Beta, as well as my pre-patch videos in the past, well, of course there's a lot you were missing, but this video should set you up on the right path to master the Shadow Priest's new rotation in World of Warcraft's newest expansion. Now in this video, we'll be covering everything you'll need to know, so how to deal the most damage in single target or in multi-target in pretty much any straightforward situation or any complicated one, how to maximize your damage depending on the amount of enemies in combat with you, and how to use your cooldowns and your talents the most effectively. We'll also be going into detail on how exactly the Covenant abilities or soulbinds alter your rotation and how to implement these factors into your gameplay. Now, if you would like to join the discussion with anything World of Warcraft related, then of course be sure to join the Discord server with the link in the description box below. Also, just a quick reminder, I'm streaming on Twitch every weekday with my schedule currently shifting around a little because of all the videos I'm making, but you'll most definitely see me every evening from 6 PM Central European Time to 11 PM, so be sure to tune in if you have any questions. Apart from that, my friends, I know that you all can't wait and prepare yourselves, so let's go right ahead and have a look. Okay. So before we get into the details here, we actually need to take a step back and summarize what has changed for you as a Shadow Priest with the launch of Shadowlands. For all of you who had watched my previous video on the rotation in the pre-patch, this will not be news for you, but for everyone who is just now starting their journey with Shadowlands, this is pretty important. Void Form in its old iteration is completely gone and is now a cooldown. The Shadow Priest has reverted back to the way it was before Void Form was ever really a thing, so pretty much before Legion, with the focus lying on dot management, tied together quite neatly with a builder and spender playstyle, where we build up Insanity, which is still our resource, with spells like Shadow Word Pain, Mind Blast, Vampiric Touch, Mind Flay, or even Void Bolt when available, as well as a couple of talents, and spend that Insanity on either Devouring Plague, which is our new big spender, or Searing Nightmare, which is a talent and our AoE spender essentially. Apart from that, various talents are gone, namely Shadowy Insight, Shadow Word Void, Dark Void, Shadow Word Death, Lingering Insanity, Legacy of the Void, and Dark Ascension, all of those you may still remember from BFA. Of course, those are quite a lot of talents which are gone now, and those are replaced with other options which just honestly suit our new playstyle better, but more on that of course in just a bit. Other talents like Fortress of the Mind, Shadow Crash, Void Torrent, and Surrender to Madness have either seen soft or hard redesigns, depending on how strongly they actually intertwined with our old playstyle, which is no more, of course. I'll go over the details of all of the talents in the Shadow Priest guide for Shadowlands, which will come out soon, as that is not really the focus of this video, but we will talk about how they impact your rotation. Apart from that, we also have some new spells this pre-patch, with Shadow Word Death and Devouring Plague being the most important ones for the rotation itself, Power Infusion, which is a new cooldown, or rather a returning cooldown actually, and Mind Soothe, which is not really important for our rotation, as well as Covenant abilities, which will also play an important role when dealing damage, which we will of course discuss. Okay, so far so good. That's all that you need to know when it comes to the rotational spell changes really, so let's now actually go ahead and look at our rotation directly. So, as stated before, your rotation will revolve around a builder and spender playstyle. We will build up Insanity with our core builders naturally by applying Shadow Word Pain and Vampiric Touch to our target or our targets, and then just using Mind Blast on cooldown while we fill the gaps with Mind Flay. Once we're at 50 Insanity, the threshold required to use Devouring Plague, we will then spend this Insanity on Devouring Plague, and essentially we will start and repeat the cycle. That in and of itself is the core and the basic concept of the rotation. Build up Insanity with everything in our core rotation, and then spend it on Devouring Plague once available. Whereas the basic construct of this rotation is fairly easy, it has incredible amounts of elevation it can go through, making it not only more fun, but also more difficult to manage depending on the amount of target you have or rather you're up against, the talents you are using, your stats, and other factors which make the spec play incredibly engaging in literally any situation, yes, even in single target. The challenge ultimately lies in managing your builders in order to not overcap on insanity, spending your insanity accordingly before you overcap or waste insanity, and maintaining your dots on all targets. In a typical single target situation in Shadowlands, your rotation is actually quite simple and revolves around proper use of Devouring Plague, Void Torrent, and your builder abilities. We'll talk about Void Torrent in the talent section, but the basics of your rotation would look like this. Engage the fight by applying your dots, then use Mind Blast, and use Mind Flay until Mind Blast is ready again. Use Mind Blast, cast Mind Flay again if needed, and once Devouring Plague is ready to be used, immediately cast it on the enemy. Refresh your dots and rinse and repeat the process. When entering the fight with Void Form ready, you will apply your dots, cast Mind Blast, cast a Void Form which will reset your Mind Blast cooldown, cast a Void Bolt, and either followed by a Devouring Plague should you have enough insanity, or by another Mind Blast should you not have the insanity yet, and then the Devouring Plague. The rotation will then fall into similar patterns as it did before the pre-patch, or rather during the pre-patch, essentially feeling like a two-step dance while in Void Form, by keeping Void Bolt on cooldown, filling with Mind Blast, and spending Devouring Plagues whenever you have them ready. The more targets you have to deal with, the more complex your rotation will become, but in single target situations, the single highest priority will always be to achieve enough insanity to cast Devouring Plague. In multi-target situations, you'll essentially be following the same basic rules, but your rotation becomes a set of priorities you need to follow, and the better you actually do them, the more damage you will deal. You'll be applying your dots onto targets, building insanity, and then spending it on either Devouring Plague or by spamming Searing Nightmare, which is usable at 30 insanity. If you're not playing with Searing Nightmare, you will just apply your dots with Misery and spend your insanity on Devouring Plague. In Mythic Plus, you will most likely be playing much more with Searing Nightmare and will spend your insanity on it accordingly. Your spell priorities should be on screen now, because again, your rotation is honestly just a spell priority list at this point, and it's your job to keep track and manage this list as effectively as possible. Now, let's take a look at your cooldowns and your talents and how they actually change your rotation. The Shadow Priest has 2 cooldowns baseline and an incredible variety when it comes to our talents, and can potentially mix and match a lot of combinations together depending on how these combinations will be balanced and how strong they'll end up being. So again, let's look at our cooldowns first. Our maintenance of set cooldowns is actually incredibly simple at this point, as you will essentially want to keep both Power Infusion and Void Form on cooldown. Void Form is the essence of your damage and will boost your damage once every 90 seconds by a considerable amount. Power Infusion grants you 25% haste and is therefore also incredibly powerful. Now, Power Infusion's cooldown is set to 2 minutes, whereas Void Form's cooldown is only at 90 seconds. Ideally, you will just want to use both on cooldown, but if the difference in their cooldowns being back up again is at around 10 seconds, ideally even less so, then it becomes an option to wait for both cooldowns to line up. I'll let you be the judge of this, because this will of course depend on the situation that is ahead of you. When in a single target boss fight, for example, ready to get into the execute stages of the fight, it will probably be worthwhile waiting the extra 10 seconds, but not really more, just to have the cooldowns align. In Mythic Plus, when moving from Trash Pack to Trash Pack, this option may also become attractive to you. Okay, now let's jump ahead and actually take a look at our talents. Unfurling Darkness will be used to apply an instant cast Vampiric Touch to a target every 15 seconds. Death and Madness will be used to snipe some extra 40 insanity from a target right before it dies, and is your go-to option for Mythic Plus at this moment, where you can utilize its insanity generation immensely, especially as it allows you to generate insanity on the fly and carry it from Trash Pack to Trash Pack. Searing Nightmare specifically will be used when you have too many mobs in front of you to handle with Misery and for longer periods of time. Currently, Searing Nightmare does very high amounts of damage in Mythic Plus, and will generally speaking be the go-to talent and the playstyle to use in Mythic Plus dungeons. Misery just loses out in most M+ scenarios at the moment because its ramp up time just takes too long, and you ideally don't want to waste so much time dotting when you could also use Searing Nightmare, of course. The point at which dotting up targets with Vampiric Touch shouldn't be a priority anymore is at around 5 targets, but it's ultimately very reliant upon the trash pack that you are fighting. If, for example, you're fighting 5 trash mobs, but 2 of those 5 die within the first 5 to 7 seconds of the fight, then using Vampiric Touch on all 5 of course is not really worth their global cooldowns invested. Also, the point of when to start spamming Searing Nightmare goes very far apart. Some very good priests say Searing Nightmare can already be used at 3 targets, while others say you won't be using it until 5 or 6 targets. The safest frame of reference is actually 3 to 5 targets, which is where you will not have enough global cooldowns available anymore to really keep your dots running while dealing some effective damage effectively, and well, the point where Searing Nightmare will really just start to deal some solid damage, and can therefore safely be switched and picked. In the Shadowlands launch meta, Searing Nightmare is quite strong and can easily already be applied once you have 3 targets in front of you, at which point you would stop investing Insanity into Devouring Plague, but into Searing Nightmare instead. Damnation, if you choose to pick it, will be held on cooldown and can also be used when you'd have to move, while Mindbender and Void Torrent will also be used on cooldown, and preferably of course in Void form. Currently, Void Torrent will be the option you will most likely be choosing the most, and when playing with Void Torrent, it becomes incredibly important to prioritize it. You will essentially always want to ensure not only to fully channel Void Torrent, but also that you can maximize its damage output with both Void form as well as with your mastery. To do this, you will want to apply both dots as well as Devouring Plague to the target whenever you're not in Void form, before then immediately spamming Void Torrent in order to make it synergize with your mastery. Surrender to Madness will be used as perfectly timed as possible in order to ensure that an enemy dies while STM is active, which will grant you a free Void form, so ideally of course you will want to try and snipe the buff from an enemy. All in all, our talents are incredibly diverse this patch, and it will be very interesting to see what players will be able to do with our kit once the game of course launches. Especially once we get the benefits of our Covenant choices involved, the gameplay will start to get even more interesting. And speaking of Covenants, let's actually take a look at their abilities next. So, Covenants are of course a big part of Shadowlands, and accordingly, so are the Covenant spells you will be able to use with each Covenant tied to it. All 4 Covenants have an active priest-specific ability for you to use, and all 4 of them alter your rotation in some way, mostly very minor, but some even slightly deeper. I'll go into detail with which Covenant you will want to be playing with and why in my Shadow Priest guide, so be sure to click the link in the info tab on the top right corner of your screen if you want to know more about that. In this video, we're going to focus specifically on how they are used in combat, starting us off with the most complicated one, which will be the Boon of the Ascended. The Boon of the Ascended needs to be activated via a cast time before changing into the Ascended Blast and the Ascended Nova. The Blast will be your main source of damage during this time, as it does deal a ton of damage and wants essentially to be kept on cooldown. It scales with your haste, but the general rule of thumb is that you will be able to fill 2 global cooldowns in between each cast of Ascended Blast. Ideally, you will want to activate the Boon of the Ascended while in Void form in order to maximize its damage output and to also have an easier time filling these 2 global cooldowns with the instant spells such as Devouring Plague or Void Bolt or even the second Mind Blast charge. In single target situations, you will rinse and repeat this, so filling 2 global cooldowns, then spending an Ascended Blast until the boon expires and explodes, in which case you want to stand in melee range to let the detonation hit as many enemies as possible. On multi-target or AoE fights, you will fill the 2 global cooldowns with your Ascended Nova, which is an instant cast, before then using your Ascended Blast when it's ready. You can also Mind Sear and then Searing Nightmare once between each Ascended Blast. Honestly, there's just multiple ways to actually approach this. Just be sure not to miss a single blast because those hit for crazy levels of damage. Unholy Nova will pretty much just be kept on cooldown. Just be sure to allow its dot component, the Unholy Transfusion, to have the maximum possible uptime if you can. Fake Guardians should automatically apply the Benevolent Fairy to yourself, which means you can either just keep the spell on cooldown or just try to align it with another Void form. Fake Guardians will not directly align with your Power Infusion either, so it's very plausible to wait for a Power Infusion to be ready again as well, just to maximize the benefit. Of course, just keep that in mind. Mind Games will simply be held on cooldown, but if you want to generate the insanity rather than only benefiting from its damage output, then be sure to use it on an enemy whenever they attack, or use any of their spells or their abilities. Okay, let's summarize everything we've just discussed. Gameplay wise, the Shadow Priest is certainly a brand new spec essentially, but it feels very well put together and just has an amazing toolkit at this point, which lets you deal with any situation that could be encountered. It'll be interesting to see if the developers decide to buff or nerf certain things after a couple weeks into launch, because the Shadow Priest definitely needs some spell adjustments currently, at least in my opinion. Searing Nightmare is quite strong, leaving little room for Misery in Mythic Plus currently, while Death and Madness is also just too enticing not to be taking most of the time, but I don't really see that changing in Mythic Plus. Mind Blast could be hitting a bit harder in my opinion, even after Mind Flay has already been nerfed. Dark Thoughts also suffers from this weak Mind Blast, but this is not really noticeable that much. All in all, we're looking at an absolutely beautiful start to an expansion in terms of balancing, but let me know what you think. Do you like the Shadow Priest in Shadowlands? Why or why not? Be sure to let me know in the comments below, and should anything change concerning our rotation, which certainly is a possibility, I will be sure to let you all know. Thank you so much for watching, and if this video was helpful to you, be sure to give it a like, and if you'd like to stay updated on the content of this channel, then feel free to subscribe. A very special thanks to my supporters over at Patreon, you guys help out a lot, and also thank you all for the gifted subs and donors, Crit, We Have Paradise, Dalai Lama, Acid Raccoon, and everyone else who I didn't mention. Thank you so much guys. Now, as always, have a good one my friends, enjoy your start into Shadowlands, and I will see you all in the next one.